Snow fell over the city in thick, silent sheets on the morning. Everything changed. And inside the 58-story tower that housed one of the country's most powerful technology companies, a young CEO crossed the marble lobby with fury written across her face. She had just come from her first major investor meeting, and the sight of a middle-aged janitor calmly wiping snow tracks off the polished floor struck her as an insult to everything she believed a modern company should look like. Without asking a single question, without knowing his name beyond the one stitched onto his uniform, she fired him in front of hundreds of employees standing frozen in the lobby. Nobody in that crowd knew that the quiet man had never once raised his voice or argued with anyone in 5 full years of working in that building. But only a few hours later, when a lawyer walked into the CEO's office carrying a sealed folder of documents, the entire tower would fall into a silence no one had ever heard before. And nothing about that morning would ever be explained the same way again. Alistair Boone was 41 years old, and almost nobody in the building knew anything real about him. He had been divorced for many years, and though he had once been called a father, there were no children left in his daily life now, only the quiet rhythm of empty mornings and long, solitary nights. He spoke rarely, and when he did speak, his words were short, careful, and never wasted. Every day, without fail, he arrived at the tower at 4 o'clock in the morning, long before the sun rose over the frozen skyline. Long before anyone else had even left their beds, he worked the night shift, moving through the empty floors, with a quiet competence that nobody bothered to notice, because nobody thought there was anything to notice in a janitor. No one knew where Alistair lived. He never posted anything about his life anywhere, never showed up in a photograph, never appeared at a single holiday party the company threw for its employees. He wore the same worn gray jacket every single day, rain or shine, snow or heat, as though it were a second skin he had long since stopped thinking about. To the people who passed him in the hallways, he was simply part of the furniture, an unremarkable fixture of the building's early morning hours, easy to overlook and easier still to forget. Most people who noticed him at all assumed the obvious story, the tired and convenient one. Here was a man who had failed at something, who had ended up sweeping floors because nothing better had ever come his way. It was easier to believe that than to wonder what a quiet man might actually know. And the truth, had anyone bothered to ask, was almost impossible to imagine. Alistair understood every pipe running beneath that building, every wire threading through its walls, every contract signed in its highest offices, and every secret the tower had ever kept from the people who worked inside it. There was a rhythm to his days that never changed, no matter the season or the weather outside. He arrived before the sun, moved through the darkened hallways with a bucket and a cart that squeaked faintly on one wheel, and left before most of the building's daytime staff had even poured their first cup of coffee. He knew which lights flickered on the 20th floor before anyone reported them, which elevator car ran slightly slower than the rest, which conference room always smelled faintly of burnt coffee, no matter how many times it was cleaned. These were small things, invisible things, the kind of knowledge that only comes from years of paying attention to a place most people walked through without ever truly seeing. Younger employees occasionally tried to strike up conversation with him near the elevators, offering the kind of polite, empty small-talk people reserve for someone they do not expect to answer at length. Alistair always responded with courtesy, a few words, a small nod, nothing more. Some of them found his silence unsettling, filling in the blanks with their own assumptions about a man who must have nothing interesting to say. Others simply stopped trying altogether, deciding it was easier to let him remain a background figure, present but unexamined, part of the scenery, rather than a person with a history of his own. There was one evening, weeks before everything unraveled, when an old security guard named Walter passed Alistair in the parking garage and said, without thinking twice about it, "Good evening, sir." It was an odd thing to say to a janitor, the kind of phrase reserved for someone far more important, and for a brief moment Walter's own words seemed to surprise him. Alistair's reaction was immediate and sharp in its own quiet way. He lifted a hand and shook his head, asking Walter never to call him that again. Walter apologized, confused, and let the matter drop. But something about the moment lingered in his mind long after Alistair had walked away into the cold. It was a small thing, easy to dismiss, and yet it planted a seed of doubt that would not quite disappear. Why would a night janitor react so strongly to a simple word of respect? Why did his eyes, just for an instant, carry the weight of someone used to giving orders rather than following them? Nobody connected these questions to anything larger, not yet, because nobody had any reason to. But somewhere deep within that quiet, unremarkable man walked a secret far greater than anyone in that glittering tower could have guessed, and that secret was about to collide, violently and without warning, with the arrival of a new woman at the top of the company. Her name was Vivian Ashcroft, and she was 36 years old when she took over as chief executive officer of the company that owned the tower. She had come from Harvard with a reputation for decisiveness that bordered on ruthlessness, and she believed, with an almost religious certainty, that image was everything a company had to offer the world. On her very first day in the role, she moved through the building like a storm, replacing managers who had served for years, tearing out furniture that had grown familiar to everyone who worked there, and ordering new uniforms designed to project nothing but modern efficiency. Vivian had little patience for anything she considered outdated. She disliked older employees who moved at what she saw as a slower pace, disliked anyone who seemed to linger too long over small tasks, disliked the comfortable, worn corners of a building that had clearly been standing, unquestioned, for far too long. Everything, in her mind, needed to be faster, sharper, and newer, because that was the only language she trusted, the only measure of success she had ever been taught to believe in. Within her first week, she had commissioned an entirely new lobby design, replacing the old wooden reception desk with a sweeping curve of glass and brushed steel, meant to signal innovation to anyone who walked through the door. She reorganized entire departments without consulting the people who had built them, believing that speed of decision mattered more than the discomfort it might cause along the way. Longtime employees who had spent 15 or 20 years learning the quiet mechanics of their roles found themselves suddenly reporting to managers half their age. Managers who spoke in the clipped, confident language Vivian herself had been trained to admire back in business school. Some employees adapted quickly, eager to align themselves with the new direction and the opportunities it seemed to promise. Others grew quietly resentful, whispering among themselves in break rooms about a woman who seemed to value appearances over substance, who judged a person's usefulness by how quickly they could answer a question rather than how well they understood the problem beneath it. Vivian heard fragments of these complaints from time to time, but she dismissed them easily, certain that resistance to change was simply the natural, forgettable noise that accompanied any transformation worth making. It was on one of those early mornings that Vivian first noticed Alistair. He was kneeling on the staircase near the executive elevators, carefully wiping down each individual step with a patience that seemed almost out of place in a building moving at her speed. She did not ask his name. She did not consider, even for a moment, what kind of life might explain such deliberate, unhurried care. She simply looked at him, said 2 words, speeded up, and continued walking without waiting for a response. Alistair only nodded. He did not argue, did not explain himself, did not so much as glance up to meet her eyes for longer than a second. Nearby, a group of younger employees exchanged a knowing look and laughed quietly among themselves. "He's always like that," one of them murmured, as though the observation explained everything worth knowing about the man. None of them imagined that the truth might be the exact opposite of what they assumed. That his silence was not weakness, but restraint, chosen deliberately, day after day, for reasons none of them could have guessed. The days that followed moved quickly toward the morning that would upend everything. A major investor meeting had been scheduled, the kind of meeting that could determine the company's next decade. And Vivian had spent weeks preparing every detail down to the smallest gesture. The snow outside grew heavier with each passing hour, blanketing the streets in white, and the temperature outside dropped far below freezing as delegates from 3 continents began arriving at the building's entrance. Among the arriving guests was a distinguished investor, an older man whose backing the company desperately needed. And as he stepped from his car onto the icy sidewalk, his foot slipped beneath him on a patch of frozen pavement. Alistair, who happened to be nearby, moved instantly, catching the man's arm before he could fall, steadying him with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything he did. It was, in every sense, an act of simple decency, the kind that should have gone unnoticed, or, at most, earned a quiet word of thanks. But in the process, Alistair's cleaning cart had been left, just briefly, at the edge of the lobby, and it happened to block the path the investors were meant to walk. Vivian, catching sight of the obstruction from across the room, felt something inside her snap with an anger she would later struggle to explain. In front of the entire board, in front of dozens of employees who had gathered to watch the delegation arrive, she turned toward Alistair with a fury that silenced the room entirely. "You're fired," she said, her voice cutting through the cold air of the lobby without hesitation. There was no explanation offered, no question asked about what had actually happened, no moment given for anyone to understand the full picture. The employees around her fell utterly silent, exchanging glances of disbelief, though none of them dared to speak up on his behalf. Alistair simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, and said only, "I understand." He reached up and unclipped the small identification badge from his uniform. The plastic card that had marked him, for 5 years, as nothing more than a member of the cleaning staff. He set it down gently on a nearby table, without drama, without protest, and turned to walk away. He did not look back at Vivian, did not glance at the investors whose meeting had just been disrupted, did not offer a single word in his own defense. He simply walked toward the exit, his old gray jacket disappearing into the swirling snow beyond the glass doors. A few of the older employees standing near the lobby exchanged uneasy glances as he passed, some of them opening their mouths as if to say something in his defense, then closing them again, unwilling to risk their own positions over a man they barely knew. One woman from the accounting department, who had worked alongside Alistair for nearly 4 years without ever learning much about him beyond his quiet manner, felt an unexpected tightness in her chest as she watched him go. She would later describe that morning to a colleague as the moment she first understood something was deeply wrong with the direction the company had taken, though she could not yet explain exactly why. The investors, for their part, seemed almost embarrassed by the spectacle, several of them shifting uncomfortably and glancing toward the exit rather than toward Vivian as she attempted to resume her carefully rehearsed presentation. The meeting continued. Numbers were discussed, projections were shared, but the energy in the room had shifted in a way that no slide deck could repair. Vivian pressed forward regardless, telling herself that decisiveness was precisely the quality these investors had come to see. Refusing to let a single dismissed janitor unsettle the image she had worked so hard to construct. What almost no one noticed, in the chaos of that moment, was the small brass key Alistair left behind on the security desk as he passed it, sliding it quietly across the counter to a startled guard. Without a word of explanation. It was an old key, worn smooth by years of handling, unlike any other key issued to the maintenance staff. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than the return of company property, a formality expected of any departing employee. Nobody imagined, in that moment, just how much confusion that single small object was about to unleash throughout the entire building. By early afternoon, the confusion had already begun. A technical manager, attempting to access the building's central control room to check the heating systems ahead of the coming storm, discovered that his key card no longer worked at the door. He tried again and again before finally calling for a master override, only to learn that the override itself required a physical key that nobody on the current staff possessed. Someone remembered, almost as an afterthought, the small brass key that Alistair had left at the security desk that very morning. When the engineers finally retrieved it and tested it against the control room's lock, it worked immediately, sliding into place as though it had been made for that exact door. This discovery led to a wave of uneasy questions moving quickly through the building's technical staff. Why would a janitor, someone hired only to clean floors and empty trash bins, possess a key capable of opening the most secure and sensitive room in the entire tower? No record existed showing that such access had ever been granted to him. Vivian, informed of the strange situation, reacted with irritation rather than curiosity. assuming it was simply an oversight from some previous administration that needed to be corrected immediately. She ordered the locks changed without delay, wanting the entire matter closed before it could distract from the demands of the coming storm. But when her head engineer returned from examining the system, his expression carried a weight she had not expected to see. "We can't replace it," he told her plainly, his voice careful, almost apologetic. The entire security infrastructure of the building, he explained, had been designed around that one original key built into the very architecture of the control systems years before Vivian had ever set foot in the company. Changing it would require rebuilding core parts of the tower's electrical and security network, a project that could take weeks and cost the company a significant sum of money it could not easily spare, especially with a storm bearing down on the city. Vivian stood in stunned silence at this news, trying to make sense of what she was hearing, and it was in the middle of that confusion that a lawyer arrived unannounced at her office door. He introduced himself formally, explaining that he represented the ownership interests behind the building itself, and he carried with him a thick folder of legal documents that he set carefully on her desk. His first question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Where is Mr. Boone?" he asked, glancing around as though expecting the man to appear at any moment. "I fired him this morning," Vivian answered, her voice steady despite the unease beginning to creep into her chest. The lawyer went pale, his hand pausing over the folder he had been about to open, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful, the tone of a man about to deliver news that would change everything in the room. He opened the folder slowly and turned it toward her, revealing pages of legal records she had never been shown before. The documents identified the true owner of the tower as a private holding company called Boone Property Holdings, a name Vivian had never once encountered during her time at the firm. At the bottom of the final page, beneath layers of legal language she barely had the patience to read, was a signature she recognized instantly, the same neat, unremarkable handwriting she had seen on countless maintenance logs left carelessly in the break room. Alistair Boone, the man she had fired that very morning, in front of the entire board, was the sole owner of the building in which she now sat. Vivian refused to believe it at first, insisting there had to be some mistake, some coincidence of names that would explain everything away. But as she pressed further into the company's private records, the truth only became more undeniable with every document she uncovered. 15 years earlier, when the original corporation that had built the tower collapsed into bankruptcy, it had been Alistair who quietly purchased the entire building, using funds accumulated from a technology company he had built and sold years before that. He had not done it to make headlines or claim credit. In fact, he had gone to considerable lengths to ensure that almost nobody ever learned his name was attached to the purchase at all. What struck Vivian most, as she read further, was what Alistair had chosen to do after acquiring the tower. Rather than replacing the staff who worked inside it, as so many new owners might have done, he had kept every single employee in place, from the executives in the highest offices down to the cleaning crews who worked through the night. He had hidden his own identity behind ordinary uniforms and modest titles, choosing to walk among his own employees, not as their owner, but as one of them, in order to understand, firsthand, exactly what kind of company he had actually bought. The realization hit Vivian with a force she had not expected, and before she had fully processed what it meant, she was already moving toward the door, pulling her coat from its hook without pausing to think it through. She needed to find him, needed to undo, if it was even possible, the enormous mistake she had made that morning in front of everyone. Outside, the storm had grown fierce, turning the streets into a blur of white, the wind cutting through even the heaviest winter coats with a bitterness that discouraged anyone from staying outdoors for long. Vivian searched for what felt like hours, moving from block to block through neighborhoods she barely recognized, asking strangers if they had seen a man in a gray jacket walking alone through the snow. Most people shook their heads and hurried past her, eager to escape the cold themselves, offering no leads, no direction, nothing but the endless white noise of falling snow pressing in from every side. She began to wonder if she would ever find him at all, if the man she had wronged so publicly had simply vanished into a city that had never known his real name in the first place. Her expensive coat, chosen for how it looked in board meetings rather than how it performed against real weather, did little to protect her from the biting wind sweeping down the avenue. Her shoes, polished and entirely unsuited for ice, slid dangerously on the frozen sidewalks more than once, forcing her to grab at lampposts and shop windows to keep from falling. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian felt genuinely small against the world around her, stripped of the authority that usually followed her into every room she entered. Out here, in the storm, her title meant nothing at all, and that realization, strange as it was, seemed to clear something in her mind, rather than frighten her. She thought back over the 5 years Alistair had spent inside that tower, wondering how many mornings just like this one he must have walked through, unnoticed and unbothered. Long before anyone owed him an apology, she thought about how easily she had assumed his silence meant emptiness. His uniform meant insignificance. His quiet nature meant he had nothing worth saying. Each block she walked seemed to strip away another layer of the certainty she had carried into the company only weeks before, until she was left with little more than a growing, uncomfortable humility. It was near a small, unremarkable coffee shop tucked into a quiet side street that Vivian finally caught sight of him. Alistair was outside, shoveling heavy drifts of snow away from the entrance with steady, practiced motions, his breath rising in visible clouds against the gray afternoon light. He was not doing it for money, and there was no sign posted offering payment for his labor. The elderly woman who owned the shop stood in the doorway, watching him work with obvious gratitude, her hand pressed gently against her lower back, where an old injury clearly troubled her. Vivian stood frozen at the edge of the street, watching a scene she never could have imagined only a day before. Here was a man who, according to the documents sitting on her desk, could have purchased that entire block of shops without noticing the expense. And yet he was out in a blizzard, doing the hardest physical labor available, simply because an old woman's back ached too much for her to clear her own doorway. It was, Vivian realized in that moment, the first time in her life she had truly seen what wealth without arrogance actually looked like. Alistair had not yet noticed her standing there, and for several long minutes Vivian remained silent, unwilling to interrupt whatever quiet purpose had brought him to that particular doorway on that particular afternoon. She watched him finish clearing the last of the snow, watched him lean the shovel gently against the wall, watched him turn toward the elderly woman with an expression of genuine warmth that had never once appeared on his face during his years working inside the tower. And then she heard him speak, his voice low and steady, carrying words that would linger in her mind long after that afternoon had passed. "A building doesn't belong to me," Alistair told the old woman, as though continuing a conversation they had clearly had many times before. "If the people working inside it aren't treated with respect." The words settled over Vivian like something physical, a weight pressing directly against everything she had believed about leadership, about value, about the proper order of importance within a company. She thought back to every manager she had dismissed without a second thought, every employee she had judged simply by the uniform they wore, every moment she had assumed that speed and image mattered more than the quiet dignity of the people doing the actual work. Standing there in the freezing air, Vivian began to understand fragments of a story that had never been told to her directly. After his marriage had ended many years earlier, Alistair had made the decision to sell the technology company he had spent his youth building, walking away from an industry that had brought him wealth but very little peace. He had used part of that fortune to quietly purchase the struggling tower, not because he saw an opportunity for profit, but because he wanted, more than anything else, to build a workplace where people were treated as more than simply names on a payroll. Rather than announcing his ownership, Alistair had chosen instead to disappear into the building's lowest paid role, taking on the identity of a night janitor for 5 long years. It was, in its own way, an experiment in humility. A deliberate choice to observe his own company from the ground up, rather than from behind a desk on the highest floor. He wanted to know, without any of the performance that came with authority, exactly who among his employees carried genuine kindness within them, who treated others with contempt when they believed no one of importance was watching, and who remained decent, regardless of who stood in front of them. Vivian stood in silence, absorbing all of it, feeling something inside her shift in a way she had never experienced before in her career. For the first time since stepping into her role as chief executive, she recognized clearly just how badly she had misjudged the value of the people around her, how completely she had confused confidence with competence and titles with worth. She opened her mouth to speak, unsure even now of what words could possibly begin to address the mistake she had made. But before she could find them, her phone began ringing urgently in her coat pocket. And the message on the other end pulled her attention violently back toward the tower she had just left behind. The storm outside had grown far worse than anyone at the company had anticipated, and its consequences were now tearing through the very heart of the building. Power had failed across several floors, plunging offices and hallways into sudden darkness. The pipes running through the tower's aging infrastructure had begun freezing under the extreme cold, threatening to burst at any moment and flood entire sections of the structure. Worse still, the heating system had shut down entirely, leaving thousands of employees trapped inside a building, rapidly losing its ability to protect them from the brutal weather outside. None of the newly hired engineers, for all their modern training and impressive credentials, understood the tower's older systems well enough to diagnose the problem quickly. They moved from panel to panel, consulting outdated manuals and half-remembered schematics, growing more desperate with every passing minute as the temperature inside continued to drop. Vivian, standing amid the chaos when she finally returned, realized with a sinking clarity that there was only one person in the entire company who truly understood every wire and pipe hidden within those walls. She found herself dialing a number she had only just learned, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for Alistair to answer. When he finally picked up, she did not bother with pride or hesitation, offering instead a simple, direct plea for him to come back, if only for the sake of the people trapped inside. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he finally agreed. And when Vivian tried to explain her reasoning, tried to apologize for everything that had happened that morning, Alistair cut her off gently. He was not returning for her, he said. He was returning because thousands of his employees were freezing in the dark, and that mattered far more than any personal grievance between the two of them. Within the hour, Alistair arrived back at the tower, still wearing his old gray jacket, moving through the chaotic lobby with the same quiet composure he always carried. He gathered the confused technical staff around him and began directing their efforts with a clarity that immediately calmed the room, explaining systems that existed nowhere in any modern manual, systems he himself had helped design and install more than a decade earlier. For several long hours, he worked alongside the engineers, climbing through mechanical rooms, tracing wires through walls, adjusting valves that only he seemed to know the location of. Slowly, section by section, the building came back to life beneath his guidance. Lights flickered back on across darkened floors. The frozen pipes were carefully thawed before they could burst, and the heating system hummed back into operation, spreading warmth once again through hallways that had grown dangerously cold. When the final system clicked into place and warm air began flowing steadily through the vents, a wave of spontaneous applause broke out among the employees who had gathered to watch, their gratitude plain and unguarded on their faces. For the very first time since he had begun working there so many years earlier, the people of that tower understood exactly who Alistair truly was, and more importantly, exactly what he had always been capable of. The quiet janitor they had overlooked for half a decade was, in fact, the single most important person the building had ever employed, the one man whose knowledge and care had just saved thousands of his own workers from a disaster that could have been catastrophic. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd, and by the time the last system was restored, everyone in that lobby was looking at Alistair with an entirely new kind of respect. In the days that followed, word began circulating that Alistair intended to sell the tower altogether, unwilling to remain connected to a place that had treated him so carelessly despite everything he had quietly given to it. When Vivian heard the rumor, she asked to speak with him privately, and he agreed to meet her in the small office that had once belonged to the maintenance staff, a room far removed from the polished executive suites above. She sat across from him, without the confidence that had once defined every conversation she led, and admitted plainly that she had judged people her entire career based on nothing more than their titles. "That is a mistake many people make," Alistair replied, his tone carrying no bitterness, only the quiet honesty of someone who had lived long enough to understand how easily such mistakes could happen. He explained that he had already begun drafting the paperwork to sell his ownership stake, believing perhaps that the building's culture was too far gone to repair, that too many years of hierarchy and judgment could not simply be undone by one difficult winter. But even as he spoke the words, something in his voice suggested he was not entirely certain he wanted that outcome either. Before any final decision could be made, something unexpected began happening throughout the tower. Employees from every department, from the executive floors down to the maintenance staff, began signing a letter addressed directly to Alistair, asking him not to leave, expressing a gratitude that had clearly been building silently for years without ever finding the words to be spoken aloud. Vivian, moved by what she witnessed unfolding around her, proposed an idea of her own, suggesting they use this moment to reshape the company entirely, building something new from the wreckage of the old hierarchy. She envisioned a workplace where job titles no longer determined how a person was treated, where age was never used as a measure of a person's worth, where the uniform someone wore said nothing about the respect they deserved. Alistair listened carefully to everything she proposed, weighing her words against everything he had witnessed during his years working in silence throughout that very building. After a long moment of consideration, he agreed to stay, choosing to give the company, and perhaps Vivian herself, a chance to become something genuinely different from what it had been before. A company-wide gathering was arranged not long after, filling the largest hall in the building with employees from every level of the organization, all curious about what had truly happened during that chaotic week of storms and revelations. Vivian stood before the crowd first, her posture steady despite the nerves she clearly felt beneath the surface, and she offered a public apology unlike anything the employees had ever heard from someone in her position. She spoke openly about the mistake she had made, about the assumptions she had carried into her role, about the lesson a single quiet man had taught her without ever raising his voice. When she finished speaking, Vivian turned toward the side of the stage and invited Alistair to join her in front of the crowd. He walked out slowly, still dressed in the same worn gray uniform he had worn for years, refusing even now, in this moment of recognition, to present himself as anything other than what he had always chosen to be. The entire hall rose to its feet almost immediately, and the applause that followed continued for nearly 2 full minutes, a sustained wave of gratitude and respect that seemed to surprise Alistair more than anyone else in the room. When the applause finally settled, Alistair declined every title offered to him that day. He refused the position of chief executive, refused the role of executive chairman, refused any formal recognition that might place him back above the very people he had spent 5 years quietly working alongside. Instead, he offered only a single reflection to the room, delivered in the same plain, unhurried voice he had always used. "This building was never built from concrete," he told them. "It was built from the dignity of the people working inside it." He chose, in the end, to keep Vivian in her role as chief executive, believing she now understood something essential that she had lacked before that difficult winter. But he asked one condition of her before fully stepping back into the shadows of the company he owned. He asked that she spend the next 3 months working directly alongside every department in the building, from the cleaning staff to the security guards to the engineers who kept its systems running, so that she might learn, firsthand, the value carried by every single person who made the tower function. Vivian agreed without hesitation, understanding clearly that this was not a punishment but a genuine gift, an opportunity to rebuild her understanding of leadership from the ground upward rather than from the top down. Over the following months, she could be found scrubbing floors alongside the night cleaning crew, standing watch beside the security team through long overnight shifts, and learning the basic mechanics of the building systems from engineers who had once felt invisible beneath her notice. Slowly, month by month, she became a different kind of leader than the one who had arrived that first snowy morning full of certainty and impatience. The culture of the tower changed alongside her. Employees, who had once felt dismissed based on their position, began to notice a genuine shift in how they were treated, how their opinions were sought out in meetings that had once excluded them entirely, how their years of quiet experience were finally being recognized as valuable rather than outdated. Titles still existed, of course, because some structure was necessary for any large organization to function, but the quiet contempt that had once accompanied those titles slowly faded from the hallways and offices of the building. As for Alistair, he never fully stepped away from the humble life he had built for himself over the years. He continued to live simply, avoiding public attention, uninterested in any recognition beyond the quiet satisfaction of watching his building finally become what he had always hoped it could be. On certain snowy mornings, long after the story of his true identity had spread throughout the company, employees would still occasionally find him kneeling on the same staircase near the executive elevators, carefully wiping away the tracks left behind by the storm, exactly as he had always done. There were smaller changes, too. Changes that never made it into any official company memo, but that everyone who worked in the tower noticed all the same. The break rooms on every floor were renovated with the same quality of furniture once reserved only for executive suites. A small but deliberate signal that comfort should not be distributed according to rank. Annual bonuses, once calculated using a formula that favored only the highest offices, were restructured to recognize every department equally for the role it played in keeping the company running. Longtime employees who had once felt invisible found themselves invited into meetings where their decades of institutional memory were finally treated as an asset rather than an inconvenience. Vivian herself changed in ways that went beyond her 3 months of assigned rotations through the building's departments. She began arriving earlier, sometimes early enough to see the tail end of the night shift finishing their rounds. And she made a habit of learning names. Actual names, rather than simply nodding politely at faces she could not place. She kept, framed on her desk, not a photograph of the skyline or an award from some industry publication, but a small brass key, a replica made at her own request, a quiet reminder of the morning she had learned exactly how wrong her assumptions could be. Alistair, for his part, never asked for any of these changes to be credited to him, and he rarely spoke about that winter, unless someone asked him directly. When new employees eventually learned the story of the janitor who turned out to own the entire building, many of them sought him out simply to shake his hand, curious to meet the man at the center of what had become something of a quiet legend within the company. He always accepted these introductions graciously, though he never seemed entirely comfortable with the attention, preferring instead to redirect the conversation toward whatever task was in front of him. Winter eventually gave way to a milder season, and the tower settled into a rhythm unlike anything it had known before Alistair's identity had been revealed. On one particular evening, as snow fell softly outside the tall windows of the executive floor, Vivian found herself standing beside Alistair, both of them looking down at the lobby below, where employees moved easily between one another, laughing, talking, treating each other with a warmth that had once been entirely absent from that space. Neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to watch the scene unfold beneath them. There was no dramatic declaration exchanged between them in that quiet moment. No need for words to explain what had grown steadily between two people who had begun as strangers, standing on opposite sides of a terrible misunderstanding. It was only a glance, brief and unspoken, carrying within it a trust that had been built slowly across months of shared effort and mutual respect. And in that simple exchange, standing together above a building finally living up to the values its true owner had always intended for it, there existed the quiet, unmistakable suggestion of something new, beginning to take shape between them, something neither of them needed to rush, and something both of them seemed, for the very first time, genuinely willing to welcome into their lives. The tower stood tall against the winter sky that evening, its windows glowing warmly against the falling snow. No longer merely a structure of steel and glass and stone, but something closer to what Alistair had always envisioned it could become. It was a place where a person's worth was no longer measured by the uniform they wore or the floor on which their office sat, but by the quiet decency they carried into every ordinary task set before them. And somewhere below, in the hum of 1,000 small kindnesses exchanged between people who had finally learned to see one another clearly, the story of the quiet man who once cleaned its floors continued to live on, not as a legend told in hushed voices, but as the simple, enduring foundation upon which everything else had been built.